They didn't knock. They didn't warn me. They sent a bulldozer straight through my garage, crushing decades of sweat and memories into rubble. The HOA president stood there smiling, waving a paper she called a permit violation, as if that single sheet gave her the right to erase my life in seconds. I wanted to shout, I wanted to fight, but all I could do was watch steel rip through the place where I'd built everything that mattered. My neighbors whispered. Some looked away, others nodded, like this was justice. What they didn't know was that the real justice wasn't standing on that curb, it was waiting in a courtroom, because the woman who thought she could bury me under rubble had no idea who she was really dealing with. That morning, they thought they'd broken me. What they didn't know was that the law in this town carries my last name. My name is Daniel Mercer, I'm 46 years old, a veteran who came home with more scars than medals, and a man who has spent most of his life fixing broken engines because sometimes it's easier than fixing yourself. My marriage didn't survive the years I was gone, and when the divorce papers came they left me with a rented apartment and an aching silence I couldn't fill. The only thing I carried with me was my daughter Emily, 15 years old, sharp-eyed and stubborn, the only reason I hadn't given up completely. The garage was more than wood and steel. It was the place where my father taught me to change oil before I was tall enough to see over the hood. It was the smell of grease-stained rags, the rhythm of a socket wrench, the hum of a motor finally catching after hours of work. To anyone else it was just a workshop. To me, it was a lifeline, the one place where the chaos of life could be reduced to bolts and timing chains. When I bought this old property on the edge of Pinecrest, the house didn't impress me much. The garage, a solid structure, weathered but standing strong, waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. Emily loved it too. The first weekend she visited, she leaned against the doorway, arms folded, pretending not to care, but I saw the flicker of pride when she said, "So this is yours?" That question meant more than she knew. It was the first time in years I could answer yes without lying. We sanded benches together, painted walls, sorted tools. For the first time since the war, I wasn't just surviving, I was building. Neighbors would drive by, slow down and stare. Some smiled, others whispered. At the hardware store, a cashier smirked when I gave my address. "Hope you get along with the board," she said. "They don't like garages." I laughed it off, thinking it was a joke. A garage had stood here for decades, long before the HOA ever drew its lines. How could anyone object to something so ordinary, so essential? But whispers grew. A neighbor warned me in hushed tones that the board had called my garage an eyesore. Another hinted they thought I was running a business, that the sight of engines and tools was driving down property values. It didn't make sense. I wasn't selling cars, I wasn't running a shop. I was teaching my daughter how to keep a wrench steady, how to build something real with your own hands. Still the looks lingered, the muttered comments at gas stations, the silence that spread when I walked into the diner. And always the same name surfacing in the gossip. Karen Whitfield, president of the Pinecrest Homeowners Association. People said she controlled everything in this neighborhood, from paint colors to mailbox heights. Some said she liked the power, others said she liked the money. All agreed on one thing: she didn't tolerate defiance. I should have listened. I should have prepared. But back then, I believed the garage was safe. I believed history, sweat, and honest work meant something. I didn't know that to Karen, it was never about rules. It was about control, and she was already sharpening her claw. I didn't meet the board all at once. First it was paper. The envelope arrived 3 days after Emily and I painted the garage door. Plain white, HOA letterhead stamped at the top like it was the seal of some royal court. Inside was a neat paragraph accusing me of maintaining an unsightly structure inconsistent with neighborhood standards. They called it a violation. They called it a threat to property values. They called it everything except what it really was. My garage, my history, my sanctuary. I read it twice, then tossed it on the workbench, oil-stained rags soaking up their official ink. "Unsightly," I muttered, looking at the fresh coat of paint Emily and I had brushed on. It was cleaner than it had been in decades. The only thing unsightly was the arrogance in those words. A week later, another envelope came, this one heavier, thicker, the fine print longer. "Failure to comply will result in daily penalties." They wanted $500, backdated from the day I moved in. If I didn't remove the structure, fines would double every week. The math wasn't hard. They weren't trying to correct anything, they were trying to bleed me dry. Then the letters turned into faces. One evening, as I came home from the hardware store, a small crowd stood at the curb outside my property. At the center was a woman dressed like she was headed for a boardroom instead of a neighborhood street. Mid-50s, pearls at her neck, hair sprayed stiff enough to withstand a storm. She held a leather binder clutched to her chest like a weapon. "Mr. Mercer," her voice carried the tone of a judge announcing sentence. "I'm Karen Whitfield, president of the Pinecrest Homeowners Association." I didn't offer my hand, and she gestured toward the garage. "This structure violates multiple community covenants. Non-compliant materials, no architectural review. Frankly, it's an eyesore, and it's dragging down property values." Behind her, the board nodded in unison like a choir of obedient parishioners. A man in khakis muttered about standards, another scribbled notes like he was recording my crimes. I let her finish, then wiped my hands on a rag. "This garage stood here before your subdivision was built, before the HOA, before your bylaws were even printed. You don't get to rewrite history just because you don't like how it looks." Karen's smile was sharp, but her eyes flashed. "All properties within Pinecrest jurisdiction are subject to the board. Your deed falls inside our boundaries. You inherited obligations when you bought here." That word jurisdiction hung heavy. I'd heard it before, overseas, the reach of authority, justified by lines on a map. But I also knew enough to recognize a bluff. "Funny thing about property rights," I said, leaning on the doorframe. "Covenants can't apply retroactively. You can't force a structure built decades ago to comply with rules written yesterday. That's not law, that's theft dressed up in legal stationery." Her binder snapped shut. "We'll see what the county says about that." She turned, heels striking the pavement like a gavel, and her little entourage followed. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of a deeper fight. It wasn't about paint or siding, it was about control. That night, I dug through the paperwork from my purchase. The deed. The inspection reports. Even a photocopy of the original permit from 30 years ago. Every document told the same story: the garage was legal, standing, and mine. But the HOA didn't care about truth. They cared about power. The knowledge nugget came back to me from a conversation I'd once had with a buddy who'd gone through something similar. An HOA can enforce covenants, but only prospectively. That means new rules apply to new changes, not to what already exists. You can't buy a house with blue shutters and then get fined because they changed the rule to green. Retroactive enforcement is a legal dead end. Problem was, most people didn't know that, and Karen was betting I didn't either. When I told Emily about the confrontation, she frowned, arms crossed. "So they can just boss you around? Just because they made up rules?" I smiled at her frustration. "Not if we know the law, not if we fight back." But deep down I knew the law alone wouldn't be enough. Karen wasn't just a stickler for rules, she was building an empire one thread at a time, and my garage had become the symbol of whether anyone in Pinecrest could stand up to her. I didn't ask for that fight, but as I stacked the letters on the bench next to wrenches and grease, I knew it was already mine. They didn't need bulldozers to start the real demolition. They used paper. Every week, another envelope slid into my mailbox. HOA letterhead crisp and smug, each one thicker than the last. The first had demanded $500. The next, $1,200. By the third letter, they claimed I owed $3,700 in accrued penalties. Daily fines, doubled weekly, stacked like sandbags until the numbers didn't even make sense. They threatened liens, foreclosure, even the forced sale of my home, all because of a garage that had stood here longer than half the houses in this subdivision. I called the number at the bottom of the letter once, just to see what I was dealing with. A board member named Richard answered, his voice flat and rehearsed. "Mr. Mercer, the association must maintain standards. If you refuse to comply, we will be forced to escalate." "Escalate?" I asked. "You've already billed me more than my truck's worth." "That garage constitutes non-compliance with our architectural review. If you remove it voluntarily, your financial burden will be minimized." I laughed into the phone, though nothing about it was funny. "That garage was built decades before your bylaws. You can't retroactively decide it's illegal." Silence. Then a muttered line, "That's for the courts to decide," and he hung up. That's when the whispers started. At the diner, I noticed heads turning when I walked in. Conversations dropped off mid-sentence. A waitress I'd known for years avoided eye contact as she set my coffee down. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then Emily came home from school one afternoon, eyes red, fists clenched. "They're saying you run some kind of chop shop," she said, slamming her backpack down. "Kids told me you're fixing stolen cars in the garage. That's why the board's after you. They said my dad's a criminal." The words hit harder than any fine. I crouched beside her, grease still on my hands from a carburetor I'd been cleaning. "Emily, look at me, you know the truth. That garage is ours. It's where I teach you to build, not break the law. They're lying because they're scared." She nodded, but the hurt in her eyes lingered. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just attacking my property, she was trying to poison the community against me, turn me into a villain so no one would question her authority. The next envelope wasn't a fine, it was a notice of intent to place lien. They claimed I now owed $11,000, and if I didn't pay within 30 days, they'd secure the debt against my home. I sat on the porch reading it, the smell of motor oil clinging to my shirt, the sound of crickets rising from the field. Rage simmered, but beneath it was cold calculation. Because here's the knowledge nugget Karen hoped I didn't know. A lien can't be enforced on false grounds. More importantly, HOA authority stops where zoning laws begin. My garage wasn't a commercial business, it was residential use, permitted and recorded years ago. I wasn't selling cars or running an auto yard. The difference between zoning violations and HOA preference was a canyon Karen couldn't legally cross. But truth rarely matters when rumor does the heavy lifting. Neighbors stopped waving. A man across the street snapped photos of me unloading lumber, muttering something about documenting violations. Another posted on the community Facebook page that my property was a blight, dragging down values. Within days, comments piled on, suggestions that I move out, accusations that I was endangering the neighborhood. Not one of them mentioned the thousands in assessments Karen had already drained from them. It was psychological warfare, and Karen played it with a smile. Emily found me late one night, sitting in the garage, letters scattered like shrapnel across the bench. She placed her hand on mine. "Dad, are we going to lose this?" I looked around the space, smelled the motor oil and cedar, heard the faint clink of tools resting in their drawers. "Not as long as I'm breathing," I said. "This isn't just a garage, it's our ground, and they don't get to steal it with stamps and signatures." She believed me. I had to make sure the law eventually would too. Because if paper was the weapon they chose, then I'd learn how to make paper my shield, and maybe even my sword. The morning they came with the bulldozer, the sky was too calm. No storm clouds, no warning, just the steady hum of diesel engines rolling up my street. I stepped outside with a coffee mug still warm in my hand and froze. A flatbed truck idled at the curb, hauling a yellow bulldozer, its blade glinting like a weapon in the sun. Behind it came two pickup trucks, board members sitting smugly in the beds, and at the center, Karen Whitfield in her pearls, clipboard tucked under her arm like a general arriving at the battlefield. Emily stood beside me, clutching the porch rail. "Dad, what are they doing?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. The bulldozer rumbled forward onto my driveway. Dust rose, the ground trembled. Karen raised a paper high in the air. "This garage has been declared a safety hazard. Under Pinecrest authority, it will be removed immediately." "Authority?" I barked, stepping down the porch steps. "You don't have authority. That garage is on my deed. It's grandfathered. You can't just erase history with a machine." Karen's smile tightened. "Your appeals are irrelevant, Mr. Mercer. The board has voted. Non-compliance has consequences." The operator revved the engine. I ran forward, waving my arms. "Stop. You put that blade through my wall and you'll be trespassing. You'll be destroying private property." That's when the sheriff's deputy appeared. Not Davidson, the old-timer I trusted, but a younger man I didn't recognize. He stepped between me and the bulldozer, hand on his belt. "Sir, I need you to stand back. They've got an order." "An order?" I snatched the paper Karen was holding. It wasn't a county permit. It was a one-page emergency enforcement resolution, signed only by Karen and her secretary. No judge, no county seal, nothing legal about it. "This isn't worth the paper it's printed on," I snapped. Karen leaned close, her perfume sharp, her voice colder than steel. "Then sue us, but by the time you're done, your garage will be rubble." The bulldozer roared. Metal met wood with a screech like tearing bone. The front wall splintered, collapsing inward as tools and shelves toppled. My father's workbench cracked under the blade, decades of scratches and memories crushed in an instant. Emily screamed, tears streaming down her face as she tried to run forward. I caught her, holding her against my chest while we watched everything we built reduced to debris. "Please," she sobbed. "Make them stop." I couldn't, not then. Neighbors gathered at the edges of their lawns, some gasping, others whispering like it was theater. Phones came out recording, but no one stepped in. No one stopped the machine. The blade carved deeper, chewing through beams and siding, scattering nails across the driveway like shrapnel. The smell of motor oil spilled into the air, mingling with sawdust and exhaust. My toolbox flipped open, wrenches tumbling into the dirt like bones from a grave. By the time the machine backed away, nothing stood. The garage that had been my sanctuary, my bond with Emily, my last tether to a life of purpose flattened into a pile of twisted metal and splintered wood. Karen handed me the paper, smug as a queen delivering her decree. Consider this matter closed. Compliance has been enforced. I stared at the rubble, fists trembling, jaw tight. You've made a mistake, I said quietly. Karen tilted her head. We've made an example. She turned, her entourage following, the bulldozer rumbling back onto its flatbed. The deputy muttered an apology he didn't mean, then walked away. Within minutes, they were gone. Only the silence remained, heavy and suffocating. Emily knelt in the wreckage, clutching a dented toolbox, tears streaking her cheeks. Dad, this was ours. You said it was. I dropped beside her, putting my arm around her shoulders. My voice cracked, but I forced the words out. I was wrong. But they haven't won. Not yet. Because in that pile of debris, I saw something they hadn't. The truth. The forged order. The illegal demolition, evidence scattered in broad daylight. Karen thought she'd buried me under rubble. What she didn't know was that she'd just given me the weapon I needed. I thought the worst part would be the silence after the bulldozer left. But it wasn't. It was the sound of my boots crunching over what used to be my life. Every step releasing the smell of oil-soaked dirt and splintered pine. Emily crouched beside me, pulling nails out of the dirt with shaking hands, as if gathering enough of them could rebuild what we lost. Leave it, I whispered. This isn't where we fight with hammers anymore. The fight had moved to paper. I sifted through the debris like an archaeologist. Every charred board and cracked tool a reminder. Then I saw it, the crushed remnants of the so-called order Karen had waved in my face. Still intact enough to read. No county seal, no judge's signature. Just Karen's name scribbled at the bottom, alongside her secretary's. They'd forged authority where none existed. I slipped the paper into a folder, brushing off sawdust. This wasn't just a memento of injustice, it was Exhibit A. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse. The building smelled of disinfectant and old paper. A place where truth was supposed to live, even if it gathered dust on the shelves. Behind the glass window sat Betty, a clerk I'd met once during the property transfer. She looked up, recognition flickering. Mr. Mercer, back again? Yeah, I said, sliding the crushed document under the glass. Tell me if this is worth anything. She adjusted her glasses, frowned, and pulled the paper close. Her lips pressed tight. This isn't a county order. You're sure? Positive. County permits require signatures from zoning, building inspection, and the clerk's office. This has none of that. And see this stamp? She tapped a faded emblem in the corner. Outdated. We retired this logo 5 years ago. Whoever drew this up copied an old template. My chest tightened. So it's fake. Betty leaned closer, lowering her voice. It's worse than fake. It's fraud. If they demolished your garage using this, they didn't just overstep, they committed a criminal act. I stood there, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, feeling both fury and clarity. They thought they were clever, thought no one would question them. But fraud leaves fingerprints. Can I get a copy of the demolition permits they filed? I asked. She typed, fingers clacking against the keyboard. A few moments later, the printer spat out a sheet. She slid it through the slot. My name wasn't on it. The address was wrong, off by 1 digit. And the signature at the bottom? Some county inspector who'd retired 3 years ago. Betty shook her head. Someone forged this. Sloppy too. I stared at the page, jaw tightening. And this passed? She sighed. If someone in zoning was paid to look the other way, it wouldn't be the first time. But I'll tell you this much, Mr. Mercer. I've worked here 20 years, and I don't like bullies. Keep digging. You'll find more. I left the courthouse with 2 documents in my folder and a new kind of fire in my gut. They hadn't just destroyed my garage, they'd destroyed their own case. That night, Emily sat at the kitchen table, flipping through her textbooks but not reading. Did you find anything? She asked, voice small. I laid the forged permit on the table. More than something. This isn't legal. They lied, and now I can prove it. She traced the fake signature with her finger. So, we can fight back? I nodded. This isn't about nails and wood anymore. This is about lies. And lies leave trails. The next few days I spent hours at the courthouse basement, where records smelled like mildew and old ink. I pulled file after file, boundary maps, HOA formation documents, minutes from their first meetings. The deeper I went, the uglier it looked. They'd redrawn association lines to include my parcel months after I'd bought it. They'd filed amendments without notifying county clerks, and every signature tied back to Karen or one of her hand-picked allies. Emily joined me one afternoon, curled up in a chair beside stacks of dusty ledgers. "Dad, this is like a puzzle," she said, eyes wide. "Exactly," I told her, "and every missing piece leads back to the same hands." By the time we left, I had a binder full of evidence: fake permits, forged signatures, fraudulent maps, enough to choke the board if the right lawyer saw it. Standing in the parking lot with the folder tucked under my arm, I felt something I hadn't since the bulldozer crushed my walls. Control. They'd thought they could erase me with one machine and one piece of fake paper. But all they'd done was hand me the rope they'd eventually hang themselves with. And I knew exactly who I needed to call next. I hadn't spoken to my uncle in years. Not because of bad blood, life just has a way of scattering family like leaves in the wind. He was my father's older brother, the kind of man who never raised his voice but always carried authority in his silence. Judge Robert Mercer, federal bench. A name people said with both respect and caution. Growing up, I only knew him as the uncle who skipped family barbecues because he was preparing for trial, the one who sent birthday cards signed in neat block letters without a personal note. He wasn't warm, but he was solid. And now, solid was what I needed. I drove 3 hours to his house on the edge of the city, folder of forged permits, riding shotgun. Emily asked if she could come, but I told her no. This was something I had to walk into alone. When I pulled into his driveway, he was already waiting, gray suit even on a Saturday. Glasses perched low, posture as rigid as if he were on the bench. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. "Daniel, Uncle Robert." We shook hands, and in that grip I felt the weight of decades of discipline. No wasted words, no wasted motion. Inside, his study smelled of leather and old books. Law journals lined every wall, case files stacked neatly as though even dust respected his authority. I placed the folder on his desk, my voice low. "They demolished my garage, claimed it was a violation. Used this as justification." He opened the folder, adjusted his glasses, and read slowly. When he finally looked up, his eyes carried something between anger and disappointment. Not at me, but at the audacity of what he held. "This isn't legal, it isn't even clever. Whoever drafted this thought intimidation would substitute for law. They've been bleeding me with fines, threatening lanes, spreading lies about Emily, and then they sent in a bulldozer. In broad daylight." He tapped the forged order with one finger. "You understand what this is, don't you? Fraud, destruction of private property, abuse of authority. Each of those carries weight. Together they're a wrecking ball. If you pursue this correctly, Daniel, you won't just defend yourself, you'll dismantle them." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. "So what do I do?" His answer was as precise as a verdict. "We don't use my gavel, we use the law, quietly, methodically, ruthlessly. You will not win by shouting at meetings or exchanging insults on sidewalks. You will win on paper, in filings, in evidence that cannot be ignored." He stood, walked to a bookshelf, and pulled down a worn legal volume. "First, property rights. Your garage predates their covenants. Retroactive enforcement is unenforceable. Second, zoning law. You are within residential use. They fabricated claims of commercial activity without proof. Third, due process. They executed demolition without judicial approval. That's not governance, that's vigilantism." I felt my chest tighten, but not with fear, with hope. For the first time since the bulldozer blade hit wood, I saw a path forward. Robert returned to his chair. "I'll connect you with an attorney I trust. Sarah Klein. Sharp, relentless, and most importantly clean. You will give her every document, every photograph, every scrap of evidence. And you will let her turn this into a case they cannot wiggle out of." I nodded. "And you?" His lips twitched in the faintest smile. "I cannot appear. Federal judges do not play in neighborhood disputes. But understand this, Daniel. My silence is not absence. The law is on your side. Use it." I left his house that evening with the folder heavier than before. Not because of paper, but because of possibility. Emily was waiting when I got home, pacing the porch. "Well?" she asked. I set the folder down, kneeling to meet her eyes. "We're not beaten. We're just beginning. We have allies now." She smiled for the first time in days, small but real. "So, we fight back?" I pulled her close. "No, sweetheart, we win back." That night I called Sarah Klein. Her voice on the phone was calm, precise, and filled with the kind of confidence only experience can sharpen. "Send me everything," she said. "I'll turn their lies into their undoing." As I hung up, the weight of rubble still pressed on me, but it no longer felt crushing. It felt like fuel. Karen thought the bulldozer ended the fight. She didn't realize it had just armed me with something stronger than steel. The law. It started small. a sideways glance at the grocery store, a muttered question outside the post office. For months, Karen Whitfield's word had been law in Pinecrest. People paid their assessments, nodded along at meetings, and swallowed every decree she handed down. But after the bulldozer tore through my garage, something shifted. The board hadn't just demolished a building, they'd planted doubt. One evening, as I was hauling debris into a rented dumpster, a man from 2 doors down lingered on the sidewalk. He'd never said more than hello before. This time he cleared his throat and asked, was it true? Did they really have a county order? I wiped sweat from my brow, pulled the folded copy of Karen's forged permit from my back pocket, and handed it over. He studied it, squinting at the outdated seal, the missing signatures. His face hardened. This isn't real. No, I said, and they knew it. Word spread faster than fire. By the end of the week, whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into questions. Questions turned into murmurs at the HOA office door. The first real crack came from an unlikely source, Beth Morrison, the HOA treasurer. She was a quiet woman, gray streaking her hair, known for baking pies at block parties. She showed up at my porch one night, clutching a folder to her chest like it might burn her hands. Mr. Mercer, she began, her voice trembling, I don't agree with what they did, and I can't stay quiet anymore. She opened the folder. Inside were invoices, thousands of dollars paid to companies no one had ever seen. Landscaping bills from a contractor based 3 states away, consulting fees to community advisors with no address, nearly $400,000 drained from HOA accounts in a year with nothing to show for it. I flipped through the pages, my pulse quickening. Where did this money go? Beth's eyes welled. Karen, always Karen, she controls the books, approves the checks, and silences anyone who asks questions. But after what happened to you, people are scared, they're angry, they want answers. I leaned back, the smell of oil still clinging to my hands from the engine I'd been working on. Then let's give them some. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Normally, a dozen people showed up. That night, nearly 70 crammed into the community hall, folding chairs scraping across the floor, the air thick with nervous anticipation. Karen took her place at the front, pearls gleaming under fluorescent lights, her board arrayed behind her like loyal soldiers. She started her speech with the usual venom: we must protect our community from dangerous elements, from individuals who refuse to comply. But this time, the crowd didn't nod. They shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered, "Ask her." Beth stood. Her voice shook at first but grew steadier with each word. "Where did the $400,000 go, Karen?" Silence fell. Karen blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" Beth held up copies of the invoices. "These payments to fake companies. Consulting fees with no records. We deserve to know where the money went." Karen's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Those are sensitive financial matters. Confidential." The room erupted with murmurs. A man shouted from the back, "Confidential? That's our money." I sat quietly in the last row, watching the empire she'd built tremble. Karen's eyes darted around the room, but instead of admiration, she saw suspicion. Instead of obedience, she saw resistance. Knowledge spread faster than fear. People began recalling laws they'd ignored before: fiduciary duty, financial audits, the right to transparency. Words Karen hoped no one would ever use. That night, neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me stopped by my porch instead. They didn't apologize, not outright, but their questions spoke louder. Is it true they forged that order? Can we demand an audit? If we push back together, can they really stop us? Emily sat on the steps, listening, her eyes wide. For the first time, she saw the tide turning. "This is just the beginning," I told them. "Karen's power only works if you believe in it. She's not law, she's not government. She's a neighbor with a clipboard and a taste for control. And control crumbles the second people stop obeying." By the time the last neighbor drifted home, I felt something stronger than anger. I felt momentum. The garage was gone, but the truth was rising from the rubble. And with Sarah Klein preparing legal firepower and my uncle's words echoing in my head, I knew we weren't just fighting back. We were about to turn the whole community against its so-called queen. The courthouse smelled of old wood and nervous sweat. By the time I walked through its double doors, every bench was full. Reporters cradled cameras. Neighbors filled the gallery, whispering as I passed. For months, they'd watched Karen Whitfield swing her authority like a weapon. Now they'd see whether that authority could stand when placed under oath. At the front sat Karen, pearls gleaming, lips tight with practiced confidence. Her board flanked her like a row of nervous soldiers. She leaned toward her attorney, a slick man with an expensive suit and eyes that never stopped calculating. When she saw me sit down beside Sarah Klein, her smile widened. To her, I was just a mechanic with grease on my boots. What could I possibly do to her in a courtroom? The judge entered. This hearing is now in session. Sarah rose first, her voice calm, deliberate. Your Honor, we are here today because my client's garage was demolished under the authority of a fraudulent order. Not a mistake. Fraud. The HOA acted outside its jurisdiction, destroyed private property, and then attempted to bury him under fabricated fines. Karen's lawyer shot up. Objection, this is inflammatory. The judge waved it down. We'll see if it's supported by evidence. Proceed. Sarah began laying out the documents one by one. The forged demolition order, the outdated county seal, the missing signatures. This is not a valid county permit, she explained, holding it up for the room. It is nothing more than stationery with Ms. Whitfield's name at the bottom, and yet, under this fake order, my client's property was destroyed. The judge's brow furrowed. Ms. Whitfield, is this your signature? Karen's jaw tightened. It is, but as president of the board, answer yes or no. Yes. Sarah didn't flinch. And can you point to any county ordinance giving an HOA president the power to order demolition of private property? Karen hesitated. We were acting in the best interests. No law then? Sarah pressed. Silence. The gallery murmured. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, realizing the woman who had fined them for flower beds and fences had no actual authority beyond their compliance. Sarah slid the next document forward, the demolition permit supposedly filed with the county. This one, she said, is worse. The inspector's name at the bottom retired 3 years before this was stamped. My client confirmed this with county records. In other words, this isn't just improper, it's forgery. Karen's lawyer objected again, but the judge silenced him with a glare. Counsel, you'd better have an explanation for this. Karen's face flushed. She leaned into her microphone. The board trusted contractors to handle the paperwork. If there was an error, Sarah's tone cut like a blade, or a convenient fabrication to clear land for a development deal, gasps rippled through the courtroom. Then Beth Morrison, the treasurer, was called to testify. She clutched her folder like a shield, voice shaking but strong. I reviewed the books, over $400,000 in assessments paid to companies that don't exist. When I asked questions, Karen told me to stay quiet. She said the community didn't need to know. Karen shot her a glare sharp enough to wound, but Beth didn't back down. The final blow came from the county clerk herself, called as a witness. Betty stood steady as she told the judge. I've worked in this office for 20 years. These documents are forgeries. The county never issued them. What the HOA did wasn't enforcement, it was criminal. The judge's gavel cracked against the bench. Enough. I've heard sufficient evidence. Karen's lawyer tried to recover, stammering about community standards and the need for order. But the words fell flat. The weight of fraud, forgery, and stolen money crushed every excuse. Finally, the judge leaned forward. His voice was steady. Final. The Pinecrest Homeowners Association is hereby dissolved. All assets are to be seized and audited. Restitution is ordered to Mr. Mercer for destruction of property, as well as to every resident defrauded by this board. Furthermore, the matter of forged county documents is being referred to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. The room exploded with noise, gasps, shouts, even a cheer from the back row. Karen slammed her hands on the table, rising to her feet. You can't do this. I built this community. Without me, it will fall apart. The judge's gaze was cold. Without you, it may finally stand. Sheriff's deputies approached. Karen's pearls glimmered one last time under fluorescent light as they guided her out, her protests echoing off the walls. This isn't over. You'll regret this. But everyone in the room knew it was over. Neighbors turned toward me, their expressions a mix of guilt and relief. For months they had believed Karen's lies, allowed her to dictate their lives. Now they saw the truth. Emily slipped her hand into mine, eyes bright. We won, she whispered. I squeezed her hand. No, the law won, and that's stronger than any bulldozer. As the gallery emptied, reporters clustered near Sarah, asking about next steps. She simply said, we're not just cleaning up rubble, we're rebuilding trust. I walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, the folder still under my arm, lighter than it had ever felt. For the first time since the blade cut through my garage, I believed we weren't just fighting an HOA, we were proving a lesson bigger than Pinecrest. Power built on fear crumbles in court. And Karen Whitfield had just learned that the hard way. The first time I stood in front of my rebuilt garage, the air felt different, not heavy with smoke and diesel, not thick with the taste of loss. This time it smelled of fresh lumber, wet paint, and possibility. Insurance had covered part of the damage, but the real victory came from the restitution order. Karen's empire of fines and stolen assessments was gone, and the money she'd hoarded now poured back into the community she'd tried to strangle. For me, it meant more than a check. It meant the chance to rebuild, not just walls, but faith. The new garage rose taller than the old one. Reinforced beams, a concrete foundation poured smooth and strong, wide bay doors that rolled open with a whisper instead of a groan. Neighbors came with hammers and paintbrushes, lending hands where months before they'd only offered whispers. I watched men who once glared at me in silence swing tools beside me, sweat running down their faces as they worked shoulder to shoulder. Women brought food, children carried boards, and for the first time, the community wasn't following orders, they were building something together. Emily stood in the middle of it all, sleeves rolled up, her eyes brighter than I'd seen in years. She helped measure, helped sand, helped steady ladders while neighbors painted trim. One evening, as the last coat of paint dried, she tugged on my sleeve. "Dad, we need something that says what this really is." The next morning, she showed up with brushes and a box of colors. On the side wall of the garage, she painted a mural, bold letters stretching across the surface, surrounded by gears and flames and mountains, 2 words that stopped everyone in their tracks: truth. Neighbors stood quietly as the paint dried, nodding, some even clapping softly. That wall became more than decoration, it became a promise. Across the street, where the HOA once planted their compliance zone signs, neighbors tore the posts from the ground. In their place, we dug soil, laid out rows, and planted a community garden. Tomatoes, beans, wildflowers. The same dirt that had once been marked with rules now bloomed with life. Children ran through rows with watering cans, their laughter mixing with the rustle of leaves. Each plant was a rejection of the fear Karen had built her empire on. Each sprout was proof that control could give way to cooperation. Sometimes in the evenings, I'd sit on the porch and watch it all. The garage doors stood open, the smell of motor oil and fresh wood blending with cut grass and blooming flowers. Neighbors stopped by with questions about their cars, about wiring, about light. I answered each one gladly, because I wasn't just fixing machines anymore, I was helping fix trust. Emily brought her friends over now, proudly showing them the workshop. No more whispers about chop shops or criminals, just laughter echoing against walls that had been rebuilt stronger than before. She'd lean against the doorway, the same way she had the first day, but this time her voice carried pride instead of hesitation. "This is ours." I'd look at the mural, at the garden across the street, and feel something deeper than relief. Resilience. We'd been torn down, humiliated, crushed under steel and lies, but rubble had turned into foundation. Out of destruction, we'd built something bigger than the garage itself. And the community noticed. Where once there had been silence and obedience, now there was unity. Meetings weren't about fines or threats anymore. They were about projects, about gardens, about kids' science fairs. The board was gone, the fear was gone, and in its place was something stronger than either: cooperation. One evening, Beth Morrison stopped by with a basket of vegetables from the garden. She looked at the mural, shook her head, and said softly, "Funny, isn't it?" She thought control was power. Turns out power was here all along, in neighbors helping neighbors. I smiled, looking at Emily as she painted the last strokes of orange flame on the wall. "That's the thing about fire," I said. "It doesn't just destroy, sometimes it forges." The garage had been my sanctuary once. Now it was our symbol. A workshop, yes, but also a monument to resilience. Proof that truth really does win when people refuse to bow. They thought they demolished my garage. Instead, they built a movement. When Karen Whitfield sent that bulldozer through my walls, she believed she was crushing a man who couldn't fight back. What she really did was light a fire in this community and in me that forged something stronger than concrete and steel. The garage they tried to erase became a symbol, and symbols have a way of spreading. With restitution funds and support from neighbors, we launched something bigger than any one workshop, the Garage Justice Fund. Its mission is simple: help homeowners fight back against abusive HOAs and corrupt boards who think power is theirs to abuse. The first month we fielded calls from 3 different states. Families who'd been fined into debt, threatened with foreclosure, even told their heritage farms were eyesores. Each story carried the same weight: ordinary people being crushed under extraordinary arrogance. I knew then this wasn't just about Pinecrest, it was about everywhere these little empires thrived. My uncle once told me the law is only as strong as the people willing to stand behind it. Now, with this fund, we're putting that strength in the hands of anyone who refuses to bow to clipboard tyrants. In Pinecrest, the changes are already visible. Where signs once ordered residents about lawn height and mailbox paint, kids now hang posters for car washes and bake sales. The community garden thrives where HOA warnings used to stand. The mural on my garage, "Truth Wins," greets every visitor like a promise carved into brick. And when people ask what we learned, the answer is simple: fear only rules until truth shows up. Emily, who once cried watching our sanctuary crushed, now walks proudly into that garage, showing her friends the workbench we rebuilt together. She tells them not about loss, but about resilience. She's growing up knowing that power doesn't belong to bullies, it belongs to those who refuse to be broken. And that's a legacy stronger than anything Karen tried to erase. But movements don't stop at one victory, they grow. Because next time, when a developer tried to pave over a century-old farm for a highway, they didn't realize those dusty deeds hid water rights older than the town itself. And the family standing on that land wasn't alone anymore. They had allies, they had us, and together they had the law. That fight is coming, and when it does, we'll be ready. So if you've been through your own HOA nightmare, if you've watched neighbors weaponize rules to line their pockets or crush your spirit, know this: you're not alone. Share your story, because every voice adds strength to the movement. Every experience exposes the truth these boards try to bury. Drop a comment below and tell us what you faced. Someone else might learn from your battle. Someone else might find hope in your words. They thought they demolished my garage. Instead, they built a movement, and that movement is just getting started.